Coming up, a refocusing of American politics.
What I want to do is restore two basic balances. One is a balance within foreign policy, and one is a balance within national security, between the foreign and the domestic.
Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haass argues for a recalibration of America's domestic and foreign policies. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Mr. Haass, as many of you know, is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Before he joined the Council, he had a very distinguished career in government, having served in 4 presidential administrations, most recently in the Bush administration as Director of Policy Planning in the State Department. He is also the author of several books. Most of them have focused on foreign policy. We are delighted that he accepted our invitation to discuss his latest publication entitled Foreign Policy Begins at Home, The Case for Putting America's House in Order, which is his lucky number 13.
If 25 years ago you had then predicted essentially the trajectory of American foreign policy, and you would have said that the lion's share of American resources, more than 6,500 young American men and women would have lost their lives, and more than 40,000 injured, and more than $1.5 trillion or so spent, and in many ways trying to refashion or remake the countries of Iraq and Afghanistan, you would have questioned your judgment about having that person be the speaker. But that's exactly what we've done, what we've chosen to do. And the Iraq War was most certainly a war of choice. The Afghanistan War began as a war of necessity after 9/11, but it morphed into a war of choice, particularly under the current president, when the United States tripled U.S. force levels and engaged then or embarked on an ambitious program to remake Afghanistan. And I came to the conclusion that that both of these were simply ill-advised. And this is no criticism of those who gave so much, but my sense is that over time we will not have results that in any way will endure or that in any way will be commensurate with the level of effort. And along the way, I thought we got distracted. That essentially foreign policy, public policy in general, is about choices, it's about priorities. And essentially, you could not have made the degree of investment, and whether it's military or economic or political or diplomatic or simply time. And as a former policymaker, time is, the bandwidth of policymakers is an important but scarce resource. There was the direct costs, but also what you might call the opportunity or indirect costs of what we did in both Afghanistan and Iraq. But at the same time, the other half of the coin was what we were or really were not doing here at home. And if we were guilty, I thought, of overreaching abroad, I thought we were also guilty of underachieving here at home. And I looked at all the things that were not getting done. Obviously, the tackling of the fiscal challenge, nothing's been done to set the United States on a sustainable trajectory when it comes, in particular, to meeting our entitlement obligations. When I look at what is not being done to modernize our infrastructure, to improve the quality of our K through 12 schools, to come up with a modern 21st century immigration policy, we could go down the line. And in all these cases, what was missing was not so much the ideas. The ideas were out there, but it was the politics. We simply couldn't come up with a political process that would function in a way that would essentially broker compromises and that would do a lot of what needed doing. So it was this combination, again, of overreach abroad and underreach or underperformance at home. And what these are really is two sides of the national security coin. And the idea that what's foreign versus domestic, to me, is a pretty artificial distinction, particularly in an age of globalization, where things cross borders with great velocity and great volume, but also our capacity to act abroad is obviously directly limited and affected by the capacities we've created here at home, whether the capacities are military or economic or human. My argument is we need a new national security doctrine. My phrase for it is restoration. What I want to do is restore two basic balances. One is a balance within foreign policy, and one is a balance within national security, between the foreign and the domestic. The foreign policy balance is essentially to end what I think is the era in which the Middle East has so dominated American foreign policy abroad as to distort it. I think there's two reasons not to have, or several, more than two reasons, but let me start with two reasons why I believe a Middle East-centric foreign policy doesn't make a lot of sense. One is that the Middle East, whatever else it is, and it's a part of the world where we have Israel, where there's 300 plus million people, there's oil, there's terrorists, there's the reality and potential of nuclear weapons. It's not a part of the world which is where the great powers come together. So it is not, for example, like Asia, or like in the 20th century in Europe, a place of great power, competition, and potential conflict, one thing. Second of all, the kinds of challenges that increasingly define the Middle East, questions of political legitimacy, sectarian strife, these are not challenges that are particularly susceptible to being fixed by American efforts, or by the efforts of any outsider. There's nothing particular about America. But I think one of the lessons I take from Iraq and Afghanistan is even enormous investments with the kinds of tools we have to bring to bear don't necessarily pay off in these situations. It's not an argument for doing nothing. Let me just cut to that chase. But it is an argument for thinking hard about what might actually be useful, where there's some relationship between effort and results. So what I think we need to do is not leave the Middle East, but I do think we need to dial it down. Choose whatever metaphor you know, think of rheostats rather than switches. But we need to dial it down. And what we need to do is dial it down, in part, to put greater emphasis on parts of the world where our interests, I would argue, are greater, and where our position to affect those interests is greater. And that, to me, is the Asia-Pacific. That is the part of the world where the great powers interact. China, Japan, Russia, India, the United States, Korea, what have you. And there's things going on in Asia that are reminiscent of Europe a century ago. One almost feels the tectonic plates of history are beginning to move there, where one has a bit of a friction between the major powers of the region, where nationalism is getting stronger, where unlike Europe, you haven't had the reconciliation, say like you have between France and Germany, nothing like that, say between China and Japan, where the institutions of Asia, while they're quite developed in the economic sense, are significantly underdeveloped in the political military sense. Again, unlike Europe. And where the United States is in a unique position because of its alliance relationships and other relationships to really be a balancer and a stabilizer. And the kinds of things we can do in Asia, whether it's the regional trade talks that have begun, whether it's honoring our alliance obligations through military presence, air and naval forces, to deal with potential for interstate conflict. These are exactly the sorts of things we're good at. Secondly, the balance between the foreign and the domestic. And as I said before, our ability to function abroad in part depends upon our ability to continue to be successful here at home. So we have the focus, but we also have the capacity. And what worries me is we're not succeeding here at home. And this is not an argument that America is in decline, because we're not. But to say that does not mean that we're not underachieving or underperforming. Of course we are. We're growing at a half to two-thirds the historic rate of post-World War II economic growth. You've had tremendous stagnation of incomes for large swaths of America. Long-term unemployment is now, alas, a widespread phenomenon. I have to be careful. Very few people come to the United States to go to our K-12 schools. A few do. But the lion's share of those who line up at our consulates and embassies around the world do so to come to Princeton and Harvard, not to PS this or that in New York. If you've recently been to any airport in the New York metropolitan area, you've taken the Acela to Washington, I need say no more. We do not have a first world infrastructure. And that significantly detracts from our competitiveness. It's a major sponge of time, a source of inefficiency. It also, by the way, leaves us much more vulnerable to either natural disruption or terrorism. I could go on, but what we're doing is essentially we've become much less competitive than we ought to be. We're spending 18% of our GDP on healthcare, twice what the OECD average is, without outcomes in any way that are proportionate to it. And we're once again in a position where it's a question of when and not if, unless something dramatic is done, we're going to run up a massive degree of debt and vulnerability. So one day what's going to happen is I think many of the problems we're seeing in American society will get worse, plus we still could face a serious economic crisis down the world when American indebtedness goes up. And by the way, another reason it will certainly go up is that interest rates are not going to be this low forever. And we face a situation where as entitlement obligations grow and interest rates go up, it crowds out everything else. And there's nothing left for national security and there's nothing left for domestic investment. Not all spending is equal. Some spending is spending. Some spending is investment. And what worries me is we're on a trajectory. We'll have basically very little left for investment in this country. So what I want is to have greater focus put here at home to right this. This is not an isolationist argument. To say that for this period of history, foreign policy ought to begin at home, it's not isolationist for two reasons. One is the foreign policy argument. When I look out in the world right now, there's any number of problems, from Syria to Iran to North Korea to cyber this, but none of these rises to the existential, as I see it. I don't see anything out there, say, that is on the scale of a Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan or even the Soviet Union during the 4 decades of the Cold War. I actually believe the United States has a bit of time and space to devote a greater proportion of its resources here domestically. And second of all, the reason this isn't isolationist is I'm not talking about departing the world. I'm talking about slight readjustments in what we do. And if we invest intelligently in our human and physical base here at home, that will position us to do more in the world down the road, either to discourage the emergence of a so-called great power rival, peer competitor, or to deal with one if it happens all the same. So this is, it's not a withdrawal from the world, and it's not a moving away from the responsibilities of national security. But again, it's looking at this strategic picture now and for the foreseeable future, saying, hey, we have a bit of time and space. We need to restore the foundations of our strength. And if we do that, by the way, we'll be much better positioned to play a leading role in the 21st century. And I think that is essential, because I'll end with this, which is we had better get this right. This is not a world, for those of you who studied Economics 101, there's no Adam Smith out there with an invisible hand organizing the geopolitical marketplace, if you will. It doesn't just work. It takes leadership, and there's nobody else out there, I believe, with either the capacity, the habits, the inclination to lead the world in the United States. Now, I know this makes a lot of people unhappy, but this is not a statement of arrogance. This is certainly not a call for unilateralism. We can't do it ourselves. We don't have the resources. Plus, the nature of the problems doesn't lend itself to unilateral effort. It's got to be multilateral. Leadership implies followership. Doesn't mean you dictate what others have to do. It means you partner with them, you collaborate with them. But the defining challenges of this century are going to be things like proliferation. They are going to be things like climate change. They are going to be things like regulating the new domain of cyberspace, about what to do about potentially pandemic flus or other diseases, about keeping an operating, functioning world economic order, trade, investment, finance. It isn't just going to happen by itself. And the Indians are not going to make it happen, and the Japanese aren't, and the Europeans aren't, and the Chinese aren't. And unless the United States plays this role, it isn't going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, it's bad for the 7 billion out there. It's bad for the 300 million plus here. So it seems to me the stakes are large. The good news is we have the opportunity, I still think, to get it right. And the not so good news is it's not so clear we're going to use that opportunity. Thanks very much.
Rita Hauser, your prescription of the pivot, get out of the Middle East, go to Asia.
I'm going to interrupt. It's not get out of the Middle East. It's reduce our involvement.
Okay, move over. I recently heard a very somewhat crude description, but Asia is the beautiful new young mistress, glamorous, and we'd love to go over there, but we can't get rid of the old hag who is on the other side. I said it's somewhat crude, but when you think about it, how do you get out of the Middle East?
First of all, I want the record to show that it was Ms. Hauser and not myself who used this crude. You are all my witnesses. No, the analogy actually I use is a much more elegant one, Rita, which is for those of you who are fans of Godfather 3, where Michael wants to leave the mob, and he says, every time I try to go, they keep pulling me back in. And I think it's the first time Foreign Affairs magazine ever quoted The Godfather when I wrote about it. And look, I don't disagree with your basic, the way you set it out. It seems to me the part of getting more involved in Asia is pretty straightforward. That's not the hard part. The hard part is the resisting of getting pulled back in the Middle East. I think you've got discretion. So if the president I mean, George W. Bush wasn't pulled into the Middle East. He took himself to the Middle East with the Iraq thing. Obama took himself. He didn't have to do what he did in Afghanistan. I think we had to do what we did after 9/11 when the Taliban government wouldn't kick out al-Qaeda. We didn't have to do much more than that. I think we had to do what we did after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. But then I thought it was very interesting. Full disclosure, I was the Middle East advisor at the NSC at the time. But the president didn't get pulled into going into Baghdad. He said, "Okay, we're going to liberate Kuwait, but we're not going to do more." So I do think presidents retain discretion about how much to try to do in the Middle East or anywhere else. Now, if events get really bad, I also think, and it's one of the really interesting pieces in our field right now, which is, one of the great transformations, and it hasn't really gotten the attention it deserves, is the energy transformation. And this year, the United States is reaching a 25-year high in oil production, a 25-year low in imports. Natural, we've got the world's probably largest supplies of natural gas. It must have some strategic consequences. That essentially we've essentially arrived at North American energy self-sufficiency. It doesn't make us independent of events in the Middle East, but it certainly makes us energy self-sufficient. It has to give us some cushion, a little bit more margin for maneuver, a little bit more discretion. So I actually think we have more choices when it comes to the Middle East than ever before. And even one other reason, during the Cold War, the Middle East was a principal venue of Cold War competition. Well, now it's not. Yes, the Russia's there, but it's not the same thing.
I wanted to ask you about what kind of alliances you imagine the United States will be making in the 21st century. Our traditional allies, European allies, are feuding among themselves. They have economic problems maybe worse than the ones we have. They, in many cases, lack the capacity to be reliable partners. Who are our new partners and where are they?
A couple things. One is, all things being equal, I think alliances are probably less critical in this era of history than they were in the previous one. And that's because alliances largely depend upon fairly unpredictable situations, predictable threats, predictable venues, predictable obligations. And one of the characteristics of this age is I think, greater fluidity and dynamism. Second of all, the European allies, it's much less central for many reasons. A lot of it's good news. Europe was the central venue of international relations in the 20th century. It was the scene of 2 world wars and a Cold War. The good news is Europe is no longer the central venue in international relations. It's boring. That's great. I mean, imagine if we could make the Middle East boring. We'd get a Nobel Peace Prize. I think Asian alliances are a more interesting phenomenon. And there I would say we've got the formal alliances with the Japans, the South Koreas, the Philippines, the Australias, what have you. And I'd say those are particularly important. One, we need partners to deal with, to manage the dynamism of the region, but also if you do not want to see in Asia, which is kind of a Katie bar the door, where suddenly the Japanese and the South Koreans start not just putting a lot more into conventional armaments, but even start reconsidering the nuclear issue given North Korea and China, then I think it's essential that the United States stay involved and that the alliance relations there remain robust. So my sense is that the traditional area of European alliances will become much less significant, but the Asian alliances will become more important given North Korea, given China, and given some of the nationalist trends. I think I'll just say one more thing on that. I think one of the trickiest things for American foreign policy over the next 5 or 10 years is going to be how to meet these alliance obligations in Asia, at the same time manage a constructive relationship with China. That will be a threading of the needle. And I actually think getting that right, that balance between alliance obligations, we do not want to have an adversarial relationship with China. We don't want to have a policy, if you will, of containment. On the other hand, there are aspects of Chinese behavior that are worrisome. Getting this right and avoiding what some of my former colleagues at Harvard called the Thucydides trap, where the great power of the day ends up in a friction-filled or worse relationship with the rising power of the day. Getting this right and dealing with the diplomatic challenge of China and the obligations to our allies, supporting them but not giving them blank checks, getting this right is going to be exquisite if we can pull it off.
Gil Roshinsky, Canadian ambassador to the UN. What, in your judgment, does the multilateral system need to do to make itself relevant again? And what role does the United States have to play in that context to ensure that this works?
Okay, you're not going to like my answer, because you're accredited to an institution that is not part of the solution. Multilateralism and UNism are two very different things. I actually think multilateralism is alive and well. UNism is not. What you might call, 190 plus countries signing up to something, approach to multilateralism, I think is probably, if it's not dead, but on big issues, it hasn't done it on climate change, hasn't done it on trade. So on select, it failed miserably when it came to cyber. On lots of issues, I don't think, if you will, UNism, that version of multilateralism can work. If it can, great, but on most issues it doesn't. So then one has to get more targeted. It might be critical countries who come together. It might simply be countries that agree. It might simply be, look, we can't agree on this part of the problem on climate change, but maybe we can agree on deforestation or dealing with that slice of it. What you end up with is kind of tailored multilateralism. And what it's, again, from it could simply be everyone agrees to put, you don't even negotiate, you consult, you negotiate, but you don't come up with agreements, where everyone then has what you might call consistent or parallel domestic policies. Certain regulatory issues you deal with that way. So you don't try to come up with an international formal agreement. Sometimes formalism, by forcing things through political systems, can be a real obstacle to progress. But if you can simply have consistent domestic issues, say you might see it under Basel III type arrangements on financial. So my hunch is you end up not with one-size-fits-all multilateralism, but every area of multilateralism you have to get pragmatic. And you basically say, look, if we could get, imagine you could get the 15 largest emitters on carbon to deal with a lot of the problem. Would you really care if you couldn't get the last 15%? The answer is no. So my hunch is we'll actually have a lot of multilateralism. It's just going to be wildly uneven as you go from challenge to challenge. I think we're going to have to be pretty creative about how we design it and how we negotiate it.
Are you in any way concerned about the growth of China in its economic and military sphere at this point?
Very little. I'm not a member of the China threat school, which is not to say that China is not growing economically. It is. Not to say it's not getting stronger militarily. It is. But two things also strike me about China. One is that interdependence is a reality. The Chinese need to export. The Chinese need to import. That argues for maintaining fairly stable relations in the region as well as with the United States. So I think there are certain constraints on China. They're not unlimited, but the constraints are meaningful. Second of all, when I look at China, look, I'm not a China expert, but when I look at China, I'm at least as struck by the challenges they face. And what an inbox. If you're Xi Jinping and his comrades, what an inbox. Now you look at the gap between the dynamism of the economy and the political system. You look at the corruption, which is profound. You look at the environmental challenges, which are extraordinary. You look at the number of sizable political protests, between 1 and 200,000 a year. You've got two competing political systems. You've got the formal Communist Party. You've got 500 million Chinese who are using the internet. You've got to rebalance your economy away from largely export-oriented to much more domestic consumption and demand-driven. Easier said than done. You've got to change the savings behavior and turn it more into spending behavior on the part of Chinese. You still have hundreds of millions of Chinese living in rural poverty who have to be moved out. And you've got all the ethnic, linguistic, on top of it all, the basic realities, if you will, of modern China. I think navigating this, I talked before about the challenges to American diplomacy in Asia. I think the challenges to the Chinese leadership are profound to get this right and to deal with the domestic pressures. And the one thing that concerns me, particularly as economic growth slows, and the days, by the way, of double-digit growth are over, and that's the real problem. Double-digit growth gave China a kind of lubricant for the society. And that was kind of the bargain, if you will, of modern China. Grow at double digits, and we'll let you, if you will, we'll have top-heavy politics in exchange for ever-rising, significantly rising standards of living. Well, those days are over. The low-hanging fruit's been picked. The economy, it's not just slowed now. It is the next, you're not going to have the next 3 decades look like the last 3 decades in terms of Chinese economic growth. So the question is, how do you keep things calm in China? It's going to be tough. And the only thing that really worries me is the rise of nationalism in China. And I think that when you look at Asia, you look at the rise of nationalism in China and Japan and South Korea and so forth, the management of this is a real challenge. And I think that's what's slightly different about now as opposed to 2 or 3 years ago. And we've seen a more assertive Chinese foreign policy. We've now seen the Japanese and Korean reactions to it. And this is what, it's just something to keep, I don't want to exaggerate it, but I think it's significant. But no, the idea that, again, the people who've been beating the drums about China's rise and all that, sure, it's rising, but you also got to remember that, one last thing, the economy, you got this thing called the denominator. Every once in a while, I think people write about China's rise, cut class. They attended class the day where you learned about the top half of the fraction, but not the bottom half of the fraction. There's this thing, they miss denominators, or they're out smoking somewhere. There is a denominator of 1.3 billion, and that kind of reduces things significantly. And I didn't even talk about demographic issues in China, the unintended consequences of one child, the aging issues. Again, it's a long, long list. So I think the internal constraints are considerable, but there will be real diplomatic challenges. And there'll be real challenges for the Chinese leaders, because there will be Chinese leaders who will be tempted. It always happens, to somehow ride that nationalism horse when there's friction in the society, whether it's to come up with a new source of legitimacy or to distract or what have you. And that to me is something worth watching.
You mentioned fractions, so I would just have to say the common denominator is we all thought you were fantastic. So thank you for being with us. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.